female reproductive system. The organs of the female reproductive system include the ovaries or the female gonads, the uterine or the fallopian tubes or oviducts, the uterus, the vagina, and the external organs, which are collectively called the vulva or pudendum. So this is the structure where a pair of ovaries are present on either side. The ovaries release egg, and this egg is collected by oviduct. The oviduct collects the egg, and then you have the uterus, the vagina, and the external female reproductive structures, which are collectively called vulva. So that's a structure of female reproductive system. Ovaries, the female gonads, the ovaries lie in the abdominal cavity. It lies in the lower abdominal cavity, and each ovary contains many follicles, which consists of a partially developed egg called an oocyte surrounded by support cells. So each ovary that has numerous follicles, and these follicles are in the form of those follicles are in different stage, and the mature ones those are known as oocyte, and there are a few supporting cells that support this oocytes. Once a month, an oocyte develops into an ovum or egg by the process of oogenesis. From the total cells, one oocyte develops into an ovum by process of oogenesis. It's not only one ovum that develops, numerous start to differentiate and develop, and out of the 6 to 7 that develop, only one forms the egg, and the process is known as ovulation. The process of expelling an egg from the ovary into the abdominal cavity, which reaches the oviduct. That process is known as ovulation. Ovulation, it is the expelling of an ovum from ovary. And this ovulation, where egg is expelled, that produces estradiol prior to ovulation, and the remaining follicular tissue, once the egg is or the ovum is expelled out, the cells that surround the ovary, they form a mass called the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum secretes estradiol and progesterone that helps to maintain pregnancy. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum, it starts to degenerate. It waits for few days. It grows, matures, and it waits for few days. Once it doesn't find fertilized egg, what happens is it starts to. So this is the structure of ovary. Ovary, you have different types of follicles. You have different types of follicles or oocytes are found in an ovary. This ovary, it has cells at different stages of growth. This one, it is having an ovum. Germinal epithelium is there. It's a mature ova is there. Once the ova is released, the cells that surround the ovum, they form what is known as corpus luteum, and this corpus luteum, it develops completely, and the production of estradiol, and progesterone is maintained by corpus luteum if egg gets fertilized. If the egg doesn't get fertilized or it remains unfertilized, what happens is there is a degeneration of this corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts to disintegrate or it degenerates within the ovary. There is always a release. Of this ovum. The ovum is covered by germinal epithelium. These follicular cells, only the ovum is released out of this ovary, and the releasing or expelling of ova from ovary is what is known as ovulation. The process is known as the prenatal maturation. The primordial germ cells or oogonia undergoes mitotic divisions, and this results in increase in size. The primordial germ cells, they undergo mitotic divisions, and then they are arranged in clusters surrounded by a layer of flat epithelial cells. They are surrounded by flat epithelial cells, and the flat cells are called follicular cells, and they are derived from the epithelium covering the ovary. These flat cells get modified into cuboid follicular cells, and then they modify into what is known as zona pellucida. This covers the ovum. This covers the ova, and this primordial germ cells or oogonia that is surrounded by this zona pellucida, and this results in what is known as primary follicle. Some oogonia differentiate into large primary oocytes where DNA replication occurs, and they enter the prophase of the first meiotic division. The first meiotic division takes place, and this results in formation of two oocytes. The primary oocytes undergo first phase of meiotic division. The surviving primary oocytes become surrounded by flat epithelial cells. Together they are called primordial follicles. At age 9 to 12 years, the pituitary begins to secrete progressively more follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These which leads to onset of normal monthly sexual cycles beginning between the ages of 11 and 15 years. This period of change is called puberty, and the time of the first menstrual cycle is called menarche. The first menstrual cycle, that is called menarche. Before the menarche, there are some cyclic changes that occurs within the body. That is the primary follicular cells, they start to mature. It undergoes primary meiotic division. And both FSH and luteinizing hormone are small glycoproteins having molecular weights of about 30,000, and the secretion of these FSH and luteinizing hormone, follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, results in growth of these primordial germ cells. The postnatal maturation. Near birth, all the primary oocytes have started prophase of the first meiotic division. Then they are arrested till puberty. So that is why we say about both prenatal maturation and postnatal maturation. Prenatal maturation, that is found till the stage of first meiotic stage, prophase of first meiotic stage. The number of primary oocytes at birth, it ranges from 6 lakh to 2 million. But the number of primary oocytes at the time of puberty, that gets reduced to nearly 4 lakhs. And of these 4 lakh primary oocytes, only 400 of them are ovulated, or they are expelled by the process of ovulation. So of this 6 lakh to 2 million, only 4 lakh that is present in the lifetime or from puberty. From puberty only this 4 lakh is found, and out of this only 400 ova happen to be ovulated in a lifetime. When a female child is born, each ovum is surrounded by a single layer of granulosa cell. The ovum with this granular cell sheet is called a primordial follicle. That's the first, when a female child is born, at that time the primordial germ cells or the primordial follicle that has an ovum with the granulosa, single layer of granulosa cells. and the ovum with this granulosa cell sheet is called a primordial. The granulosa cells are believed to provide nourishment for the ovum and to secrete an oocyte maturation inhibiting factor that keeps the ovum suspended in its primordial state in the prophase stage of meiotic division. That is the reason why, because of the secretion of this oocyte maturation inhibiting factor, the ovum is suspended and it is kept in the primordial state in the prophase stage of meiotic division. At puberty, follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland begin to be secreted in significant quantities. The first stage of follicular growth is moderate enlargement of the ovum itself, which increases in diameter twofold to threefold. Then follows growth of additional layers of granulosa cells in some of the follicles. These follicles are known as primary follicles. FSH causes accelerated growth of 6 to 12 primary follicles each month. The initial effect is rapid proliferation of the granulosa cells, giving rise to many more layers of these cells. That's the first reaction what happens. It's a follicular stimulating hormone. It's a follicular stimulating hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland. Once this is secreted, the follicular stimulating hormone is secreted, this acts on the ovary. This acts on the follicles of the ovary, and about 6 to 12 primary follicles. Primary follicles, they have a single layer, they have an ova which is covered by a single layer of follicle. This starts to grow rapidly. This grows rapidly and this grows about 6 to 12 times that, this grows about 2 to 3 folds the size of the initial primordial follicles. And this FSH or follicular stimulating hormone that induces about 6 to 12 primary follicles. It initiates growth of 6 to 12 primary follicles each month. And the proliferation is in the sense that numerous layers are formed around the spindle cells derived from the ovary interstitium collect in several layers outside the granulosa cells, giving rise to a second mass of cells which is called the theca. Initially only ova and granulosa sheet is present, and then this granulosa cells, outside this granulosa cell, there's a second mass of cell that is developed which is called the theca. Theca is divided into two layers. In the theca interna, the cells take an epithelioid characteristic similar to those of the granulosa cells and develop the ability to secrete additional steroid sex hormone which is estrogen and progesterone. That is done by theca interna. The outer layer, the theca externa, it develops into a highly vascular connective tissue capsule that becomes the capsule of the developing follicle. During proliferation, the mass of granulosa cells secretes a follicular fluid that contains a high concentration of estrogen. Accumulation of this fluid causes an andrum to. The follicle enlarges and is called the Graafian follicle, the mature one. The ripe one, the primary follicle, that becomes the secondary follicle when an antrum follicle is formed. Follicular antrum is formed, and then that is known as secondary follicle. Then where the fully matured secondary follicle is called the Graafian follicle. Estrogen is secreted into the follicle and causes the granulosa cells to form increasing number of follicular stimulating receptors. This causes a positive feedback effect. The pituitary follicular stimulating hormone and the estrogens, they combine to promote luteinizing hormone receptors on the original granulosa cells, thus allowing luteinizing hormone stimulation to occur in addition to follicular stimulating hormone stimulation, and creating an even more rapid increase in follicular secretion. It's a pituitary follicular stimulating hormone that is released, and when this follicular stimulating hormone that increases growth, or that proliferates growth and the differentiation of this primary follicle into secondary follicle, and this secondary follicle, it is covered by an theca. This theca interna and theca externa. Of this theca interna, that brings about production of estrogen, and the pituitary FSH and the estrogen combine to promote luteinizing hormone receptors on the original granulosa cells, which allow luteinizing hormone stimulation to occur. So FSH is already being produced by pituitary gland. This brings about growth of the follicular cells, and the follicular cells produce estrogen, which combine with this estrogen combined with the follicular stimulating hormone to producing luteinizing hormone receptors. The luteinizing hormone that is produced by pituitary, that has to reach the ovary, and it requires receptors. So this estrogen and FSH, it combines and enhances the receptors on granulosa cells, thus allowing luteinizing hormone stimulation to occur. So both FSH and luteinizing hormone stimulation that creates rapid increase in follicular secretion. The increasing estrogens from the follicle plus the increasing luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland act together to cause proliferation of the follicular thecal cells and increase their secretion as well. After a week or more of growth, but before ovulation occurs, one of the follicles begin to outgrow all the others. The remaining 5 to 11 developing follicles involute a process called atresia. It's the first, only one is ready for ovulation. So the one that completely develops, actually that's brings about degeneration of the other growing follicles. That brings about involute, or this brings about atresia of other growing ova or oocytes. And these follicles are said to become atretic. About 2 days before, the rate of secretion of luteinizing hormone by the anterior pituitary gland increases markedly, rising 6 to 10 fold and peaking about 16 hours before ovulation. FSH also increases about 2-fold to 3-fold at the same time. And the FSH and LH act synergistically to cause rapid swelling of the follicle during the last few days before ovulation. There is increase in FSH and LH which peak 2 days before ovulation, and this peaking of LH and FSH, that brings about rapid swelling of the follicle during the last few days before ovulation. The luteinizing hormone also has a specific effect on the granulosa and theca cells, converting them mainly to progesterone secreting cells. So this brings about progesterone. Till now we have talked about only follicular stimulating hormones, luteinizing hormones, as well as estrogen that is produced by theca interna. Now the progesterone secreting cells, that is also induced by luteinizing hormones. So the granulosa and theca cells, they now start to produce progesterone. Therefore, the rate of secretion of estrogen begins to fall once progesterone increases the rate of estrogen that begins to fall about 1 day before ovulation, while increasing amounts of progesterone begin to be. And the luteinizing hormone causes rapid secretion of follicular steroid hormones that contain progesterone. Within a few hours, the two events occur, both of which are necessary for ovulation. The theca externa, the capsule of the follicle, begins to release proteolytic enzymes from lysosomes, and these cause dissolution of the follicular capsular wall and consequent weakening of the wall, resulting in further swelling of the entire follicle and degeneration of the stigma. There is rapid growth of new blood vessels into the follicle wall, and at the same time prostaglandins, the local hormone that causes vasodilation, are secreted into the follicular tissues. These two effects cause plasma transudation into the follicle, which contributes to follicle swelling. Finally, the combination of follicle swelling and simultaneous degeneration of the stigma causes follicle rupture with discharge of the ovum. The ovum that is present within the follicle, only the ovum is discharged out through ovulation, and this discharge is brought about by swelling. This discharge is brought about by swelling of the follicle, and the swelling of the follicle, that is again by the prostaglandins, which is secreted into the follicular tissues, and this brings about plasma transudation into the follicle, which brings about follicle swelling. And once a follicle swelling occurs completely, that results in follicle stimulating, and degeneration of the stigma occurs. This causes the follicles to rupture with discharge of the corpus luteum, or the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. Once the ova is expelled out, after expulsion of the ovum from the follicle, the remaining granulosa and theca interna cells, they change rapidly into lutein cells. They become what is called lutein cells. They enlarge in diameter 2 or more times and become filled with lipid inclusions that give them a yellowish appearance, which is a process which is known as luteinization. And now whatever follicle that remains, that is what is called corpus luteum. So corpus luteum, ova is expelled out from the follicle, from the secondary follicle. The secondary follicle matures into Graafian follicle. The Graafian follicle, it swells. There's a plasma transudation that takes place in the Graafian follicle. It ruptures and releases the ova. Whatever follicular cells that is left, the granulosa cells and the theca interna and the theca externa, they now form what is known as lutein cells. And this lutein cells, they are yellow in color. They are yellowish in color because of the lipid inclusions. Because of the lipid inclusions, they become yellow in color, and the process is known as luteinization. Now the Graafian follicle, with the rupture of ova, now it is known as what is known as corpus. The corpus luteum is a highly secretory organ, secreting large amounts of both progesterone and estrogen. Lutein cells proliferation, lutein cells proliferation occurs, enlargement occurs, secretion occurs, and this is followed by degeneration. It's a highly secretory organ secreting large amounts of both progesterone and estrogen. And this corpus luteum, it starts to become its development or its enlargement of corpus luteum that occurs initially after the process of ovulation. And this corpus luteum, once it is enlarged, that keeps the rate of progesterone and estrogen under control. It secretes the hormone progesterone that brings about the changes after ovulation. The granulosa cells in the corpus luteum develop extensive intracellular smooth endoplasmic reticula that form large amounts of the female sex hormones progesterone and estrogen. The theca cells form mainly the androgens, androstenedione and testosterone rather than female sex hormones. In the normal female, the corpus luteum grows to about 1.5 centimeters in diameter, reaching this stage of development 7 to 8 days after ovulation. The first 14 days from FSH and LH secretion, it takes, that's the stage where you have the ovulation on the 14th day, and 7 to 8 days after ovulation, the corpus luteum has grown up to 1.5 centimeters. Then it begins to involute. Atresia also occurs here, and eventually it loses its secretory function. The secretion of progesterone and estrogen is reduced, as well as the yellowish color, the lipid characteristic yellowish color also diminishes, and about 12 days after ovulation it becomes the Corpus Albicans. Corpus Albicans is the degenerated or atresia form of corpus luteum. During the ensuing few weeks, this is replaced by connective tissue and over months is absorbed. Low blood concentrations of both FSH and LH result, and loss of these hormones finally causes the corpus luteum to degenerate completely, a process called involution of the corpus luteum. At this time, the sudden cessation of secretion of estrogen, progesterone and inhibin by the corpus luteum removes the feedback inhibition of the anterior pituitary gland. The release of once progesterone and estrogen production has enhanced. After ovulation, there is a decline in production of LH, luteinizing hormone, as well as FSH. This is actually because of a feedback inhibition of the anterior pituitary gland. And now when the amount of progesterone, estrogen and inhibin is completely absent, or that is of low level, because the corpus luteum that has degenerated completely, the feedback is removed, and pituitary glands starts to secrete FSH and luteinizing hormone again. The paucity of secretion of progesterone and estrogen at this time also leads to menstruation by the uterus. And now it has taken about 28 days from the first initial secretion of FSH and LH or luteinizing hormone by the pituitary gland. So now the paucity of secretion of progesterone and estrogen that leads to menstruation by the